Admiral, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can hear me, and I'm close to the mic. All warfare is based on deception, is what the Chinese general Sun Tzu said 2,500 years ago in The Art of War. We may go further and say that all life is based on deception. The scientist Robert Trivers, in his remarkable book, Deceit and Self-Deception, Fooling Yourself the Better to Fool Others, points out that deception exists at every level in biology, from the gene to the cell, to the individual, to the group. And that deception, in his words, infects all the fundamental relationships in life. That is, parasite and host, predator and prey, plant and animal, male and female, neighbor and neighbor, parent and offspring, and even the relationship of an organism to itself. When the US Joint Chiefs of Staff define military deception, or MILDEC, as actions executed to deliberately mislead adversary decision makers as to friendly military capabilities, intentions, and operations, they are describing no more than what viruses and bacteria do every single day, disguising themselves as body parts in order not to appear foreign. So what Trivers sees in biology is a co-evolutionary struggle between deceiver and deceived, which continually improves adaptations on either side. Why this is significant to us gathered here today is that one such adaptation is intelligence itself. He's talking about ordinary intelligence, but it applies to military intelligence too, because he says that both the detection of deception and often its propagation have been major forces favoring the evolution of intelligence. He notices the irony that dishonesty has often been the file against which the tools of truth have been sharpened. And he points out a human truth too, that it is the brightest child who tells the most lies. Now, the simplest way to mislead an adversary is simply to hide things from him. Keep it secret, stupid. If you can conceal the growth of your air force, as the Nazis did in the 1930s, or lie about the size of the ships that you're building, as they also did, you can deceive your opponents as well as disconcerting them when your hand is revealed. Hiding things always requires security, because if somebody else knows what you have put where, it is no longer concealed. So deception always involves complete paranoia about security. Actually, this is perfectly natural. A study of ravens has discovered that there is elaborate behavior around catching, hiding or burying food when they think that another bird may be watching. It's interesting that the corvidae, who are the brightest of all birds because they have the biggest brains, are the most knowledgeable about hiding and pretending. They actually pretend to hide things. So it's the same as the words of Sun Tzu. Military devices leading to victory must not be divulged beforehand. The second way to mislead an adversary is to present them with false information. Now, there's a caterpillar of one butterfly species that curls up into a ball and then emits the smell of ant larvae, so that soldier ants will actually carry this bundle into the ant's nest. And then, once inside the nest, it imitates the sound of a queen ant, so it gets fed first. As Sun Tzu says, hold out weights to entice the enemy, feign disorder and crushing. Now, to go to the First World War, very early on, there's quite a good example. When Winston Churchill was running the British Admiralty, he sent out a memo dated the 21st of October 1914, very early on. He said, "It is necessary to construct without delay a dummy fleet. 10 merchant vessels should be selected at once. They are to be mocked up to represent particular battleships of the 1st and 2nd battle squadrons. The actual size need not correspond exactly, as it is notoriously difficult to judge the size of vessels at sea, and frequently even destroyers are mistaken for cruisers. We are bearing in mind particularly aerial and periscope observations, where deception is much more easy." Now, one of Churchill's fake warships was an 11,000-ton American ocean liner SS Marion, which was then mocked up to look exactly like the 25,000-ton battle cruiser HMS Tiger. They added a fake smokestack and a rack of dummy guns. Sent to the Mediterranean, this paper Tiger Marion met its end off the Dardanelles in May 1915 when she was torpedoed by UB-8 of the German Black Sea Flotilla. And the Unterseeboot captain let 5 transports go by in order to nail what he thought was a battle cruiser. Down went the ship, and luckily nobody died because the dummy guns were made of wood and they floated, and half the crew got ashore clinging to the fake guns. I choose this example because the Royal Navy was quicker off the mark on decoy deception operations than the British Army, probably because rouge de guerre were traditional in the Navy, changing flags, doing things like this. It's always gone on. And in fact, the Germans were doing it too. The famous cruiser Emden, the Phantom Raiders that they had, this used to pose as a British cruiser in the Indian Ocean. But the British didn't just have passenger ships pretending to be warships, they also had armed vessels pretending to be cargo boats. These were also invented by Churchill in a memo in November 1914. These mystery ships, which were also known as Q ships, appeared then in November 1914, and it worked like this. Most submarines, because torpedoes were precious, would actually surface in order to use their deck guns to shoot the ships, having got the crews to abandon them under the rules of war. But when a submarine was on the surface, it was vulnerable, and so these Q ships would have hidden guns, they'd drop the covers and shoot. It's all very dramatic, it's very good journalism, and in fact they only sank 11 submarines in the whole war, which is about 10%, 11% of the total sunk by ships and planes. But it was useful. Deception was really important to the Director of Naval Intelligence in the First World War, Admiral Sir Reginald Hall, Blinker Hall as he was nicknamed. His first biographer wrote, Admiral Hall enjoyed nothing more than planning ruses to deceive the Germans. His second biographer cites many examples, including one in which he lured, according to this biographer, Admiral von Spee to his death in the Falkland Islands by actually sending a false message from Berlin to Valparaiso, sent via Naumann, in the correct code, telling him to attack the coaling station in the Falkland Islands, whereas the British knew they already had Admiral Sturdy and fleet down there. There was a question earlier about how do you get creativity into intelligence, and Admiral Hall was a man who thought outside the box. He did not just employ naval officers. He was the man who brought in all kinds of outsiders, academics, barristers, bankers, novelists, writers, women. First person to employ women, it was a largely sexist organisation, as you can imagine, but he brought in some very capable women to widen the scope of his intelligence. And he's also the man who re-energized signals intelligence when he took over Admiralty Room OP-40 and turned it into ID-25. As we know, signals intelligence was very important to the British in the First World War. Admiral Hall is also the man who brought America into the war by his playing of the Zimmerman telegram. You will remember that Zimmerman, the foreign minister, sent a telegram to Mexico saying, we will support you if you attack the USA. Hall got hold of this telegram, completely illegally breaking American law, hid all that, but managed to release the information to outrage, to get the moral outrage of America to bring them into the war. Now, to go back to that dummy memo, this phrase, aerial and periscope observations that Winston Churchill used, it's very significant because aerial and periscope observations were two of the new means by which the enemy could perceive your own forces. And deception is essentially playing with or distorting the perceptions and conceptions of your enemy. In The World Crisis, his 5-volume history of the First World War, Churchill points out how technology completely altered the nature of war, that the machine gun paralyzed the armies, that the submarine paralyzed the fleets. And aerial observation, of course, is an enormous game changer. There had been balloons and there had been kites before in the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, the Sudan campaign, the Boer War, but the First World War is the first major war of aviation. And as has been pointed out, I think have the development of the fighter and the bomber, but probably for military intelligence, the most important thing is what you get is photo reconnaissance for the first time. And it's really no coincidence that the word camouflage entered the English language during the Great War from the French. Biologists had already noticed concealing coloration and mimicry in the animal kingdom, a phenomenon that evolved over millions of years, ever since eyesight began. Predator-prey relations, people hiding, disguising themselves. But we didn't have the right word. The word did not emerge until 1915, when the French painters, who were the first camoufleurs, started hiding their artillery from enemy spotter planes overhead, either by blending them into the background or disrupting their shapes with Cubist-style patterns. C'est nous qui avons fait ça, said Picasso, the first time he saw painted guns. He said it to Gertrude Stein when he saw painted guns rumbling through Paris, and they had all kinds of zigzags on them. Now, World War I camouflage wasn't just for the vertical view against Raptor aeroplanes, like ground animals scurrying away. On the horizontal plane, you had acres of painted hessian and all kinds of netting to put up to hide things from the binoculars and the sniper scopes of the enemy. But the British always saw the principle behind screening. Deception, not concealment, is the object of camouflage in one pamphlet. And camouflage is the art of concealing that something is being concealed. Deception is the keynote. Now, this is clearly the case with dazzle painting, which appeared in 1917. You could not hide a smoking great ship on the high seas, but you might confuse a submarine captain about what he's aiming at. Which bit of the ship he was looking at and which way it was going. Now this razzle-dazzle, this was ideal for pictures. When I normally give a talk like this, you'd see what I mean. It was invented by a painter called Norman Wilkinson on a train coming back from a fishing trip where he'd been looking at fish and light refracting through the water. And he was in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, and he thought, well, you couldn't make a ship invisible, but what if you could distort its external shape through violent color contrast? And so what he came up with was a kind of optical illusion. I don't know if you've seen these pictures, they used it in the Second World War too, of violent stripes and zigzags all around the ship. And it's extraordinary, it's like vorticism against a U-boat commander's vision. And in fact, the submarine sinkings went down and people thought this is magical, it worked, it's wonderful. The probable real reason is that they reintroduced convoys. But the people on the ships felt better. There was a kind of magical effect that we are protected by this weird painting. Deception couldn't take place very easily in the trenches. You had to have mobility to do it. And Palestine, 1917, where you can have cavalry and movement, was where a lot of deception was practiced. General Allenby captured Jerusalem in 1917. This changes the whole of the history of the Middle East, the mandate, and many of the problems that we have now. And he used an enormous amount of bluff, deception, and signals intelligence. One writer has called this actually the first modern intelligence war, and it's worth looking at that campaign. And one incident I want to talk about is the famous haversack ruse purportedly carried out by Major Richard Meinerzagen in 1917. He was described by T. Lawrence of Arabia, Meinerzagen, as a student of migrating birds drifted into soldiery, whose hot, immoral hatred of the enemy expressed itself as readily in trickery as well as violence. The story goes like this. Meinerzagen rode out on his horse to draw rifle fire from an enemy patrol. He then slumped in his saddle and rode away, intending to be wounded, having dropped his rifle, his binoculars, his water bottle, and a blood-stained haversack. Okay? And inside this bag was details of Allenby's plans about what was going to happen. A feint against Beersheba and then a direct attack on Gaza. Of course, the real plan was the other way around, feint left and go right. Now, Meinerzagen's myth is that Kress von Kressenstein, the German commander, swallowed his hook, line, and sinker, fell for it completely, and the attack succeeded. There is much debate about this, whether this actually took place, was Meinerzagen involved, but the fact is he swooped in, invented this story, and took all the sure that hasn't happened elsewhere, but I think we can imagine. He was a very ruthless man, and there are many stories about him. I tell them about him in my book. He was a scientific cheat as well. But he had a very clear vision of deception. He made a great distinction between what he called negative camouflage, which is merely hiding things, and then what he called positive camouflage, which is what we would think of as tactical and strategic deception. A great deal of activity, building things, moving things, fake radio traffic, creating a hive of activity, not just painting things green and sitting there. You mentioned the first and second, the two wars together. And in my book, Churchill's Wizards, the book is about 1914 to 45, and in a sense it's the same war. Similar allies, similar enemies, and there are great continuities and parallels. My grandfather was in both British expeditionary forces that went backwards at the beginning of both wars. He was in the retreat from Mons and then the retreat to Dunkirk, so he saw the parallels. But what you do see in deception is that Admiral Hall, who ran naval deception, came out of retirement and passed on the torch and his methods and his ideas to Admiral John Godfrey, who was the Director of Naval Intelligence, a very good Director of Naval Intelligence, in the Second World War. And his personal assistant, of course, was the airplane, as you know. And there is a similar continuity in military deception, from General Allenby in the first to General Wavell in the Second World War. Now, in 1917, Archie Wavell was one of Allenby's staff officers in Palestine. He walked through the Jaffa Gate when they liberated Jerusalem with T. Lawrence. But in 1939, Wavell was not only writing Allenby's biography, but he had his own job. He now was Commander-in-Chief Middle East. And Middle East was an enormous theatre. It stretched from Libya to Iraq, from the Balkans to Kenya. It's thousands of square miles. And he did not have enough British Empire troops to do the job. He had to husband what he did. But in order to make himself seem stronger, he needed deception. Now, when Wavell had been in command of British troops in Palestine during the Arab Revolt in the 1930s, he spotted two particular officers who he later encouraged. One of them was Ord Wingate, the man who founded the Jewish Night Squads, who Wavell picked in 1940 to lead the guerrilla warfare, first in Ethiopia to liberate Abyssinia in 1941, and then to lead the Chitnis in Burma against the Japanese. And the other man he picked was a very theatrically minded brigade major called Dudley Randall Clark, who he selected in December 1940 to be effectively his chief deception officer, although he was never called that because deception, by its very nature, is absolutely top secret. Waspish, elusive, possibly gay, certainly transvestite. He was arrested in Madrid wearing women's clothes. Dudley Clark, a most interesting man. There are pictures in my book, by the way. It's available very cheap on Ed Books or Amazon. Dudley Clark became really the master of the game. It's not just my book. If you read Michael Howard, you read Thaddeus Holt, Dudley Clark is the man. This is the man who becomes the master of the game. He's like an intelligence impresario, if you like, who systematized the whole of British and Allied deception in the Second World War. He was very imaginative, as I say, very theatrical. He did the pantomimes at the Staff College. He loved the theatre and the cinema. And his brother, T.B. Clark, wrote many of the famous British Ealing comedies. So there was a tradition there. And he used to like working in the cinema. And once, in an Egyptian flea pit, Dudley Clark was watching Five Graves to Cairo. I don't know if you've ever seen this film. And he saw Erich von Stroheim playing Rommel. I mean, it didn't look like Rommel. It was tremendous Erich von Stroheim part. And he had an idea. He thought, well, if Stroheim can play Rommel, why don't we get an actor to play Montgomery? And so he could pretend to be Montgomery in the Middle East while Monty's actually in London preparing for the invasion of Normandy. And that is how you ended up with Operation Copperhead in 1944, in which an actor, Clifton James, impersonated and became the book and the film I Was Monty's Double. Dudley Clark idea. All that was much later. Dudley Clark actually learned an enormous amount from his first deception operation against the Italians early in 1941, which went completely wrong. Wavell was going to attack Eritrea, and he asked Clark to create the deception he was going to attack a part of Somaliland. Clark puts on a good show, but instead of reinforcing Somaliland, the Italians said, oh, there's going to be an attack. They withdrew all their troops and put them in Eritrea, which was precisely what he didn't want them to do. And this then became the hard and vital lesson. Deception is not what you make the enemy think. That's a job of propaganda or political warfare. It's what you make the enemy do. Actually, Clark was not an intelligence officer. He was originally a gunner who had RFC wings, and he was a trained staff officer. And so he knew exactly how the military system worked. And so when Wavell appointed him, he reported directly to the commander-in-chief, and he positioned himself so that he was not in any of these, but he was across intelligence and operations and plans. As one of his disciples, Peter Fleming, the brother of Ian Fleming, said, in order to tell lies properly, you have to know the truth. This is important. If you're isolated or in a despised intelligence role considered inferior, you're not going to have this power of access. You also have to understand how the enemy intelligence operate, how they think, how they work, how they classify things. You have to know the sources from which he obtains his information. Only then can you start tampering and tinkering with his perception, drip-feeding random, erroneous information into his eyes and ears. One way of telling a story is convincing detail. And to manufacture authentic evidence, Clark's A-Force orchestrated the complete resources of visual deception. In the desert, this was particularly possible because it's flat, it's empty. 3D models throw long shadows. They look much more authentic for a fast reconnaissance plane. And so they used enormous 3D dummy trucks, tanks, fuel dumps, railheads. They had portable covers that could turn a tank into a truck and a truck into a tank. They, like the 3-card trick, you could switch dummies with the real thing, fake tanks, then real tanks, real guns, moving around like that card trick. A-Force, they employed sonic deception. They recorded tanks revving and then played them in certain places. They spread sibs, sibilari, rumors or gossip with leaky diplomats or in cities from Istanbul to Lisbon. Snippets of information. They created fake documents, false insignia, bogus radio traffic, double agents, wireless sets, all kinds of misleading information, lulling the Germans and Italians either into a sense of false security or insecurity in the wrong place. And thus you end up, after Operation Bertram, by a marvellous system of camouflage. Churchill told the House of Commons in November 1942, after the Battle of Alamein, because of this marvellous system of camouflage, complete tactical surprise was achieved in the desert. So there was a theatrical element to it. One of the most important things that Clark did was to create, was the idea of notional or imaginary forces. Essentially, this was to deceive the enemy order of battle analysts. They're all drawing up exactly what the other side has got. And so, his first unit that he made up was airborne, the Special Air Service Brigade, with a battalion of parachutists and 2 battalions in gliders, none of which existed at all. But when a Scottish soldier called David Stirling wanted to set up a new force of commandos in June 1941, Clark asked him, would you use my fake name, please? And that is how the SAS, the Special Air Service, got their name. They gave a real unit using an imaginary name. This is how it works. And Clark, incidentally, had also named the commandos in 1940 when he was in Whitehall. And it's quite possible he also named the US Rangers through a paper that he wrote for Wild Bill Donovan. So he was involved with the setting up of special forces at the same time. This notional forces was a very serious game that was played out over years and years. And it's extraordinary that with that little acorn of the SAS, it grew and grew into an enormous tree with 8 notional brigades, 32 divisions, 10 corps, and 3 entire armies that appeared on the German order of battle analysis that did not exist at all. The crown of this oak was German intelligence's belief that in the summer of 1944 that there was a first United States Army group in Kent, led by General Patton, poised to invade the Pas de Calais. This made the German High Command do something very important. They didn't just think about it. This meant they kept 21 crack German divisions in Calais rather than moving them down to Normandy. Not for 2 days, not for 2 weeks, but for nearly 2 months. So this Allied D-Day deception, Fortitude in context, it says this is Fortitude South, Fortitude North, capital of Norway. But Fortitude South, which protected Operation Neptune, the movement of hundreds of thousands of men, eventually 2 million men across the Channel, with fuel and ammunition and supplies and transport across the Channel to invade Normandy. It must be the greatest military deception in history, I should think, in terms of its consequences. But why did Fortitude succeed? It succeeded because, firstly, there was almost total security in Great Britain, which, because it was an island armed against invasion, was more easily done. You had complete control, as we've heard, of the press, post, wireless, telegraph, telephones, immigration, emigration. You had control of airspace, so no reconnaissance aircraft could photograph inconvenient things, or they only saw what you let them see. You had complete domination of signals intelligence, so almost all German messages could be intercepted, deciphered, interpreted, and acted on. So, if the Germans have no image, their signatures compromised, they must rely on their human intelligence, the adverse spies. Well, every single spy that the adverse sent into Britain was picked up and either executed or turned into a double agent, feeding back false information via the double cross system run by MI5 in conjunction with London Patrolling Section, which coordinated Allied deception across the world. And following Dudley Clark's idea, the London Patrolling Section was right in the cabinet war rooms, next to operations, next to plans. It was integral to it. So the Germans' most trusted agents, Brutus, Garbo, Tate, Zigzag, were all working for the British. And it's the 9th of June message from Agent Garbo, known as the V-Man Arabal to the Germans, saying that the Normandy landings are really a feint, that the real invasion is going to come in Calais, led by General Patton and the 1st United States Army Group. They're going to land, it's Operation Mars, they're going to land in Calais, and they're going to thrust a dagger straight into Germany. And this, there's evidence of this, that Hitler saw it, persuades him not to move those troops to Germany. And a mistake for which we are all extremely grateful. And not the least, Churchill and Montgomery and Eisenhower, who in their histories and their memoirs all pay extraordinary and fulsome tribute to those deception measures and diversionary operations which made the D-Day landings succeed 70 years ago. I've got about 2 minutes left. I began with Robert Trivers. His book is about deception and self-deception. And it is a very interesting book because it goes beyond mere biology into false historical narratives and the self-deception that he talks particularly about the war in Iraq in 2003. And whereas you can see this kind of deception that I briefly sketched, it was enormous, and the Second World War was justified or is legitimate because you have a just war. What Trivers points out, and others have pointed out, that it's rather different in 2003. There is deception, but it's not against the enemy. It is against partly the citizens, and there's lots of people that they're saying is involved with Al-Qaeda and 9/11, and that there are weapons of mass destruction. But more than that, the biggest danger for intelligent people is self-deception. Believing what you want to believe, having grotesque overconfidence that it'll all be all right, you will be welcome. And just in relation to what we're talking about, telling truth to power, remember that line in the DLR memo, the intelligence and the facts are being shaped to fit the policy. And people may have told the truth, but they won't listen to. I think when you have a model like the Second World War, it works far better than that. That's my conclusion. Thank you.
Fortunately, you didn't take after your topic. It was a very clear presentation about illusion. Maybe it's not quite fair. You stretch your story already backwards 25 years. But I started wondering, now I understand why they had their show of camouflage and so on so easily together in 1939 and 1940. But then you get the question, why did they have their act together so quickly in 1914? And listening to your story, I thought, well, you had the right persons in the right place at the right time. That could be an answer. And then my second thought was, is there a history or a future of deception? Or is it all the same since Sun Tzu and doesn't it have a future and will we be doing the same thing again in 10 years from now?
I'm not sure quite how to, there seems to be several questions there. Partly, what Sun Tzu says is if you are strong, pretend to be weak, and if you're weak, pretend to be strong. My thesis, partly in the book, is that we had to rely on perception because we were weak, particularly after Dunkirk. The measures after 1940 when we have lost half the army, all the equipment. You have to use other methods. Deception has always happened in warfare, and it will go on. But who are you trying to deceive? This is the point. And where do you draw the distinction? Everybody's aware of deception. If you take an example at the beginning of the war, we've talked about, take the Mechelin incident. The Germans' plane gets lost in the fog, and it lands, and the man's got the plans for the attack. And he tries to burn them, and then he burns his hand and then he tries to seize the revolver to kill himself, because he's given away the plans. Well, if you read John Colville's diary, the British thought it was a homicide group. They thought it wasn't possible. The Venlo incident also, the belief that, oh, there's a good German. It's actually Walter Schoenberg in disguise, but no, we want to believe that there's anti-Nazis, so and then you don't believe the real Oslo report. So the point is, the difficulty is always, what is wheat, what is chaff? What is true, what is not true? That is the problem of intelligence, isn't it? That there's so much noise. What is the signal? Finding the true signal, or the signal of truth, amidst, and there's more noise than ever now, as people have mentioned. You're deluged with information. How can you pick out the true signal from that? And, well, blustering and shouting and pretending and creating, smoke screens covers up your own confusion. It maybe buys you time. The king of camouflage is the octopus. I don't know if you've ever seen what an octopus can do. The French camoufleurs had a chameleon. The octopus is incredible. It's got, within 2 seconds, it can blend into its back. There's no defense. It's fat and soft. It's like a writer. Its only defense is fighting and clouds ink. But it has brilliant camouflage. And go on YouTube, Google octopus camouflage, and look on YouTube. You will be amazed. And maybe all defenseless countries have to do some kind of octopus activity. I haven't answered your question.
Yes, then.
Ben de Jong, University of Amsterdam. By the way, Bob, in response to your earlier question, deception, of course, played a very important part in the Russian campaign in Ukraine. So in that sense, it's very topical. But I wanted to ask something else, namely, do you think, Nick, that the brilliant deception operation that the Allies pulled off during the Normandy landings that you were talking about, would it have been possible if the Allies hadn't read the German messages? Because it would seem to me that was an essential part of it.
Absolutely. I agree with you, because that's the feedback loop that enables you to monitor whether things are being heard or listened to. I think it's total dominance in signals intelligence that enables it. Because what has happened is they are essentially blinded, and you can hear and listen and see. You have, what's it called, full spectrum dominance, I think is the term. Is it not? Something like that. And yes, definitely, it's absolutely crucial. And by that stage, you know, you've gone beyond simple codes. You now had Colossus and Tiny being broken and high-level codes. You had it was on breakthrough speed in 1944. It's extraordinary, and I think that is a huge part of it. Definitely.
Martin, thank you for that. I have a question. As you said, the real point to convince is to go into detail. So let me go into detail. First, concerning Africa. Both sides did it. Both sides monitored each other's radios. Both sides used camouflage. Both sides built dummy armies and so on and so on.
Yes.
So I could argue that in the end, none of this mattered. That really what mattered was the fact that Alabama, for 2 years, for all the brilliance of Dudley Clark, the British lost and lost and lost. Okay?
Yes.
They lost. Until at Alamein, because of the fact that they were operating 100 kilometers from Cairo and Alexandria, and Roma was operating at 2,000 kilometers from Tripoli, and the number of troops at Montgomery's disposal was 3 times as large as that of who, by the way, was not there because he had Jewish, right? And the number of modern tanks that Montgomery had was 4 times as large as that of the Germans. That is why the Germans lost and were finally beaten. And, well, would you say that that is nothing to do with it, but much less than those diplomatic accounts would make one think. Plus, Operation Fortitude. In 1944, almost every German Abwehr officer in France was involved in the conspiracy against Hitler. Okay? Almost all of them, in one way or another. Abwehr in France was precisely the hothouse of the conspiracy against Hitler, which didn't work further because they had nobody in Berlin basically to do what had to be done. And there is a theory that the real reason why the Operation Fortitude succeeded is not because of the brilliance of Allied intelligence and counterintelligence, but because every single one, or almost everybody in the Abwehr organization was a traitor. And then what the Germans would see as a traitor, and later did see as a traitor, executed by Hitler. Okay? So you could argue that, again, the real reason for success in this particular case was not that Operation Fortitude succeeded in misleading the Germans, but the Germans wanted to be misled. But in this particular case, it was not just wishful thinking, it was deliberate. And I'd like to know what you think about that. Thank you.
Well, no, I think I would agree with you. For 2 reasons. I mentioned false historical narratives. And in some sense, this presentation of your own story and your own successes, the emergence of these deception stories came at a particular time. The German wrote a book about how the British had been totally deceived in the Low Countries. Operation North Pole, I think it was called. This so upset people, they said, well, we've got to show that we could deceive them. And so you get the Operation Mincemeat book coming out. So you have these counter-narratives, which are positive, how brilliant we are, how much better we are. I thoroughly agree with you about the Abwehr, that this isn't just a British success, it's a total German failure. I agree with you. Admiral Canaris, we saw his death date, 1945, he was executed. Lots of them were. The other fact is this, that you have a system where you do not have intelligence officers who question what's going on. There must have been some who were traitors. There also must have been some who thought it was fishy, but didn't want to say so because they're in a system that if they say this is dodgy, they might get shot. So they will just say yes upstairs. But no, I don't disagree with you at all. I think that it's very interesting how late we had the ultra revelations in 1974, but the deception stories came out later and later. When Michael Howard wrote his volume 5 of History of British Intelligence, Mrs. Thatcher delayed it for 10 years because the scandal about Anthony Blunt broke, and she didn't want anything more about the secrecy coming out. And it's really quite extraordinary. Many of the big books that come out in the 80s and the 90s, it's very late, and of course, it is a narrative, and there are stories in which I talk one, that is self-aggrandizing. And self-aggrandizing, overconfidence, is part of that self-deception. You start believing your own myths. And I think your critical view is necessary and salutary, and probably more true than my story.